conscious that in your A-level measure for measure exam you're going to need to refer to different productions. Well, in this video I'm going to include screenshots from 4 different productions: 1979 BBC, 2004 the live production from the Globe, 2006 Bob Komar's film, and also the 2019 ROC production. We're going to look at 8 Act 1 from these 4 different productions. I'm going to give you screenshots and my analysis on key moments and show you how to integrate this within your essays. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
I'm going to explore these 4 different interpretations in chronological order, starting with Desmond Davis's 1979 production of Measure for Measure for the BBC. Each production will show a slightly different Vienna, with differing levels of debauchery depending on the director's vision. Is it a place totally out of control, making the Duke's desertion and temporary appointment of Angelo not just a good idea, but essential? Or does much of the debauchery appear good-natured, mutual, and representative of a Vienna in which sex creates vibrancy and positive energy? One problem with Angelo's crackdown is, of course, that he seems to target the wrong man to be his example, his name. Yes, Claudio has had sex, but it was most mutual, and Juliet is fast his wife, save that they do the denunciation lack of outward order, i.e. they are effectively married. It's just that their marriage hasn't yet been solemnized by the church. This version of events is backed up by Juliet, and so the audience, especially modern audiences, will surely be left with the impression that Angelo's treatment of Claudio and his demands for his execution is harsh and disproportionate. This will seem all the more the case in productions which show that Claudio and Juliet do have strong feelings, do love each other, as is the case here within the BBC production. This hug, this desperate clinch, comes in the middle of Lucio's speech. He has just made a poor taste gag about the perilous nature of Claudio's head, i.e. it's so close to being chopped off that even a milkmaid could do it. And this results in Juliet grabbing Claudio, embracing, crying bitterly before being led off. Lucio then continues his speech by saying, "Send after the Duke and appeal to him." The effect of this is that we feel even more pity for the young couple and even more rage at Angelo for his poorly targeted crackdown. Lucio also comes across as more sympathetic. In this production, it seems as though he's prompted to suggest that Claudio should appeal to the Duke after witnessing their embrace and Juliet's hysterics. Another key dynamic in the play is that between Angelo and the Duke. Why exactly does the Duke decide to abscond and put Angelo in charge? Is it because he wants his deputy to do his dirty work and clean up the mess that he has allowed to grow in Vienna? Or is he additionally motivated by genuine fascination at how Angelo will respond to his newfound all-powerful position? What is interesting in this production is the very particular way the Duke pronounces the words precise. Lord Angelo is precise. The adjective is said very deliberately, almost scornfully, and the audience is left with the unmistakable impression that the Duke does not like aspects of the man he is leaving in charge, that he feels that being so particular, so pedantic, so puritanical may not be a positive thing. To develop further, this impression of dislike may even imply that the Duke may be actively willing Angelo to fail, and that his fall, when it comes, may provide him with genuine pleasure. So how might we weave in a reference to this BBC production within an essay? Well, this question asks for an exploration of the extent to which the play was about the difficult relationship between justice and mercy. A paragraph exploring this question could be: the Duke's startling transferal of power early on in the play gives an insight into the problems in Vienna in relation to justice and mercy. As he explains to the friar in Act 1, Scene 3, he has not consistently applied the city's strict statutes and most biting laws, resulting in the law becoming more mocked than feared. Put otherwise, the relationship between justice and mercy has fallen apart, with no one, or very few, being punished or legally judged. Everyone has been able to do whatever they want, and the rulers have not been in a position to show mercy. But actually, there are signs throughout the play that the Duke may not be particularly interested in justice or mercy as much as control and his own ego. For instance, it is by no means certain that the main reason the Duke transfers power to Angelo is because he wants Vienna to become well governed again. At the end of Act 1, Scene 3, he intriguingly suggests that he wants to see how power may affect Angelo after describing him as precise and scarce confessing that his blood flows. In the BBC 1979 production, the Duke seems to spit out the word precise very deliberately in a way which implies that he dislikes the pedantic, attention to detail character of his deputy. Within this interpretation, the Duke's early evident dislike of Angelo may suggest that, far from appointing him to reinstate the twin pillars of justice and mercy, he may be more interested in watching him fail before returning to resume his dismal, lackadaisical rule. Next, onto a 2004 production filmed at the Globe and broadcast live on BBC 4, excitedly introduced by Andrew Marr. Mark Rylance played the Duke, with Liam Brennan starring as the eventually creepy Angelo. As ever with a Globe production, there is plenty of physical horseplay, and here in Act 1, Scene 2, you can see Lucio lunging for the first gentleman's private parts, at the same time as saying the adjective painful. This causes the first gentleman to cry out in pain, gives the audience a laugh, and provides a general insight into what they are talking about, sex. The first gentleman has previously declared that Lucio is good velvet, which may refer to the luxurious, flamboyant clothes he is wearing, made in France, but also imply that he has had so much dirty sex that he has ended up with the STD syphilis, which was known as the French disease. The National Geographic website explains how syphilis came to be called the French disease. Essentially, it was spread by King Charles VIII of France's troops having sex. After implying that Lucio has syphilis, the first gentleman asks him whether he is speaking feelingly now, with feelingly referring not just to the pertinency of his illusion, but also his private parts. Thus, it is fitting in this production for Lucio to continue the motif by literally feeling his counterpart in Banter's private parts, giving an insight into the kind of Vienna the Duke has temporarily abandoned, a place where chatter and jokes about sex is commonplace and arguably an essential part of any enjoyable, lively conversation. In Act 1, Scene 3, the Duke persuades the friar to disguise him as a priest and also shows his interest as to how Angelo will lead Vienna in his absence. In the Globe production, he is wheeled onto the stage within a laundry basket, resulting in laughs from the audience as he sheepishly and in an undignified way pops his head out and throws various garments out of his way. You can see the friar picking up one of these garments from the floor and looking indignant within this screenshot. This entrance is so light-hearted and pantomime-esque that it makes it harder to take the Duke particularly seriously. When we think of the text, Act 1, Scene 3 is set in a friar's cell with a priest. What the Duke is saying is actually very serious. He is talking about the transfer of power, the failure of his government to implement certain laws, the fact that the general population has become contemptuous in relation to law and order. However, in this production, seeing the Duke pop out of the basket, swaddled in various elaborate scarves and fabrics, makes him someone to be laughed at and ensures the tone remains light-hearted in spite of the superficially serious content of what he says. In terms of how we respond to the Duke in the play as a whole, seeing him resort to such undignified measures does make us more inclined to agree with Lucio's description of him in Act 4, Scene 3 as someone fantastical, fond of dark corners. Which of course brings us perfectly onto this exam question. To what extent do you agree with the statement that the Duke is fantastical and of dark corners? Whilst modern audiences may have misgivings about the Duke's subterfuge in the play, there is no doubt that his original decision to relinquish power is founded in logic and good sense. Angelo seems to be someone able to dispassionately and methodically dispense justice. He is someone of stricture and firm abstinence. And so the Duke's decision to temporarily pass the reins onto his deputy seems prudent rather than fantastical. In particular, the reference to Angelo being strict and able to abstain from, presumably, the sexual lusts that seem to pervade the majority of Viennese inhabitants seems particularly helpful. However, what of the Duke's behaviour whilst disguised as a friar, and indeed his decision to disguise himself in the first place? Is this fantastical, or something incredible or preposterous, something more appropriate for a fantasy than befitting a leader of an ancient noble city? The fact that the Duke, in the Globe's 2004 production of the play, emerges at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 3 from a basket with a flowery scarf still hanging from his neck does seem to suggest something fantastical and rather silly about the whole enterprise. Nonetheless, it is important to recognise the regularity with which Shakespeare would employ the dramatic device of disguise within his plays. Think of Rosaline in As You Like It, or Viola in Twelfth Night. This would be seen as adding comic intrigue and plenty of opportunities for amusing dramatic irony rather than being fantastical in itself. That said, a crucial difference between the two aforementioned disguised characters is that the Duke already has power as a male and a ruler. Is there something particularly sinister and unsettling about the way he manipulates characters such as Isabella and Mariana, which seems beyond the usual scope of a disguised Shakespearean character, making us inclined to agree with Lucio's striking description. Next, on to a 2006 film version of the play directed by Bob Komar. This film only lasts 72 minutes, and so, as you would imagine, there are some very significant cuts and changes, including this addition at the very beginning. Although these lines do not appear in Measure for Measure, they are largely Shakespearean and are based on an exchange in Act 3, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet between Tybalt and Mercutio, which ultimately leads to Mercutio's death and Romeo getting furious revenge by killing Tybalt. However, the context in this film version of Measure for Measure is far less serious and tense. In this film, these words are spoken in a toilet. In this version, when the Duke comes to the verb blow, he looks irritatingly up at Aeschylus and clearly means that she should blow away and get out and leave him to his sexual pleasures. And so within this production, the Duke is clearly as much a part of the out-of-control sexual excess as anyone else. In Act 3, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's play, when Lucio declares mischievously that the Duke would have paid for the nursing 1,000, he had some feeling of the sport, and would put a ducat in a beggar of 50's clack dish, implying that he paid for sex, there is plenty of doubt as to whether this is true. Considerably less doubt in this production. Here the Duke is clearly unfit to lead, as well as needing some uncomfortable persuasion to forego his sexual pleasures in order to attend to official business. He is seen taking cocaine. And what of the business that Aeschylus wants the Duke to attend to? What can be so important that it can mean he has to be dragged out of some toilet? Well, outside it is carnage. Soldiers are shown burning the Union Jack, laughing manically. This is clearly a place out of control, and this man clearly has no idea what to do. How can a druggie, willing to partake in casual sex in a toilet with his subordinates close by, be the man who will restore law and order? So perhaps Claudio does need to be publicly humiliated and shown thus to the world, to send a message to the general population that sexual excess will no longer be tolerated and will be punished. Within this world, Angelo has to take a stand. And even if Claudio is a little unlucky to be the person targeted for his clampdown, publicly dousing his bruised face with freezing cold water may lead to the beginning of a much healthier, more ordered, happier, cleansed society. Indeed, this director emphasizes Angelo's initial good intentions by adding a section in which he goes into the chapel to ask for confession. And you can probably guess who he ends up confessing to: the Duke, who in his disguise has donned a shaggy black wig and sunglasses to indicate, quite appropriately, blindness. He is the slightly stooping figure on the left in this screenshot. In the dialogue, once again, we see the insertion of lines from another Shakespeare play, this time All's Well That Ends Well. Friar Thomas says light-heartedly to the Duke that the soul of this man is his clothes, presumably referring to Angelo being so strict and severe that his smart, tight-fitting military uniform reflects his inner austerity. Nonetheless, Angelo seems utterly genuine in this scene, and at this point in the film clearly wants to do the right thing and take the necessary harsh measures to clean up the community. This addition means that the Duke's claim in Act 3, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's play that he is confessor to Angelo is literally true, rather than a glib means of trying to reassure a panicking Isabella that Angelo is merely making an essay of her virtue. In this production, this drug-snorting, pill-popping, sex addict of a Duke must, over here, be closely involved in all intrigue from all parties. After all, this way he can watch others cleaning up the mess that he has allowed to grow and satisfy his own idle curiosities about his number two. This exam question requires candidates to probe the idea that Measure is a play in which power is invariably misused. Here's a paragraph mulling over this question, referencing the Bob Komar production. It is important to reference Angelo's good intentions when unexpectedly given control of Vienna early on in the play. Modern audiences may groan at the idea of a man being imprisoned and threatened with death just for having sex. Yet Claudio himself recognizes that he has committed an offense, and that to some extent his punishment is just. In Kumar's 2006 production, we see Claudio being publicly humiliated in front of his fellow soldiers. He is doused in freezing cold water whilst bare-chested, with other soldiers looking on and laughing. Such humiliation has been ordered by Angelo, but given that the beginning of the film has shown drug-taking, flag-burning and sexual cavorting in a toilet, the viewer is likely to feel that making an example of someone is necessary, and that Angelo may be using his new power prudently in order to send a strong message to the rest of the community that from this point onwards sexual excess will be punished. Indeed, the director of this production emphasizes Angelo's desire to use his power sensibly and morally by adding a scene in which he visits the chapel to ask for confession. So Angelo's early presentation shows at least a desire to use his power justly, even if his choice of a person to make an example of is questionable. Claudio is already engaged to Juliet and fast his wife. My fourth interpretation is the RSC's 2019 production of the play, directed by Gregory Duran, with Anthony Byrne playing the Duke and Sandy Grierson as Angelo. I find the opening interesting. There is a kind of waltz in which a series of splendidly formally dressed couples dance, most properly. There is nothing remotely sleazy or lewd about proceedings. All is measured, all is calm. However, when the music starts to get quicker, this Duke begins to look increasingly confused and bewildered. He must bring a halt to the proceedings, and so shouts, "Aeschylus!" The music stops, dancers exit the stage, and 5 seconds or so later, the Duke introduces the topic of governance to a rather startled female Aeschylus. Our early impressions of the Duke here are simple. Could he simply be a killjoy, someone determined to stop others having fun because he isn't having any? And make no mistake, this production is certainly full of characters having fun. Here you can see Mistress Overdone, an outrageous larger-than-life transvestite, laughing loudly, slamming her handbag into the first gentleman, following his impertinent question about her hips, which implicitly suggests that she has developed syphilis through far too much dirty sex. And here Lucio takes delight in Claudio and Juliet's sexual union by crudely bringing together his cigarette box and matches, so that the audience and poor innocent Isabella are in no doubt about what has happened, as well as how much he enjoys talking about sex. Time now to think about how you might integrate a reference to the RSC 2019 production within an essay question, namely the idea that the women in the play are dominated by the men and the extent to which this is correct. Here's a sample paragraph on this topic. It's difficult to argue against the idea that the women in the play are dominated by the men. There is poor Isabella, who is repeatedly intimidated and threatened by Angelo before being left speechless and aghast in the RSC 2019 production following the Duke's bolt from the blue marriage proposal. There is poor Mariana, who has been manipulated and dominated by men seemingly for her entire life. Prior to the events of the play, she was abandoned by Angelo, resulting in appalling stagnation and miserable passivity. During the play itself, she is used as a tool within the Duke's highly elaborate plan and seems to have no voice other than to say, "Yes, please." However, there are moments of female agency, particularly within modern productions in which a female actor takes on a male role. This inevitably alters the power dynamics, providing additional authority for someone who appears female on stage, e.g. the female Aeschylus in the RSC 2019 production, but also the Duke in a 2021 production at the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse. Within Act 1, Scene 2 of the play, there is also a female character who seems prepared to exchange banter and lewd jokes with the men and isn't afraid to speak her mind, Mistress Overdone, as well as having the self-assurance required to brush off the first gentleman's insinuating question about her hips. And in the RSC 29 production, she goes one step further by slamming her handbag into the speaker's chest. She isn't afraid to stick up for newly arrested Claudio, declaring him worth 5,000 of you all.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, taking you through 4 different interpretations of measure for measure and helping you